So our reading this morning from Luke is at a very important part of the Gospel of Luke. It's a turning point in the Gospel story of Jesus' ministry. Up until now, Jesus has been ministering in Galilee, a sort of an itinerant ministry where he's just sort of going around from place to place and meeting with crowds. He starts out by ministering in towns and things, and then the crowds get bigger and bigger, and he has to meet outdoors. And we have a number of different stories about that and about the miracles that he does during that part of his ministry. But our reading this morning begins with a phrase, as the time drew near for him to ascend to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. Now, in the original language, the phrase would go something like he set his face towards Jerusalem. And the idea here is that the language that's being used in this passage is very strong language to do a couple of things, to show Jesus' commitment to the ministry that's ahead of him. But also what we won't see in our English translation is that in the Greek, over the next several verses, the writer uses the word face in a number of different kinds of phrases and sayings to sort of reiterate the message that Jesus has made a solid commitment to go to Jerusalem regardless of the stakes or the dangers that are involved there. So while he's up in Galilee ministering out there, we know that the people from Jerusalem, the religious leaders and the priests, have taken some notice, but he doesn't pose as great a challenge or threat to their authority until he actually will be in Jerusalem. And we see in other stories when Jesus is approaching Jerusalem, we see in John's Gospel that when he goes to go heal or raise Lazarus, that there's concern about his threats on his life because of how close it is to the city of Jerusalem. And that's the center of power and the center of religious holiness for the Jewish people. So when it says that Jesus has resolutely set towards Jerusalem, we need to see this as a very important turning point in his ministry. And the rest of the section, or the rest of this section, which will encompass several chapters, is what's called the Road to Jerusalem ministry. So from now on, Jesus is on the road until he arrives at Jerusalem, and then we begin the Passion account, or the account of his ministry in the temple, and the account of his trial and his death, and then his resurrection. That all takes place in Jerusalem. And between now and Jerusalem is on the road, as scholars often refer to it. And we'll see that in some of the ways in which Luke phrases things, especially at the beginning of this section, how he talks about, and then this happened and that kind of stuff. But he doesn't give any details, like the village that they go into to prepare the way. We don't bother saying what the village is or where the village is. It's just on the road. And the most important vista or horizon now in the story until we get there is Jerusalem itself and what's going to happen there. You'll also notice at the beginning of the section that it says that as the time drew near for him to ascend to heaven. And there's a clue there as to some of the stuff that's going on in just the section that we're reading this morning, and we'll come back to it. But Luke is centering in on Jesus' final ascension more than on the crucifixion at this point in his story. And we have just come from a portion of Luke where Jesus was up on the mountain and transfigured in front of 3 of his closest disciples. And the conversation that Jesus was having with Elijah and Moses was about his exodus from the earth, which refers to his ascension to heaven. So keep those things in mind as we continue. I want to bring up the verses and sort of go through them as we talk about this, just to make sure that we remember them. As the time drew near for him to ascend to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. He sent messengers ahead to a Samaritan village to prepare for his arrival. But the people of the village did not welcome Jesus because he was on his way to Jerusalem. So what's happening here is that if you were to look at a map of Palestine or of, let's see, what was it called again? I should be using the word that the Romans called it. Judea? No, I don't think they called it that. They called it Palestine? Okay, so that area where Israel is, was, has been again kind of thing. During Jesus' time, you would have Jerusalem and the area around it in the south of what was the original kingdom of Israel. And in the north, you have a section called Galilee, which is an area where Jewish people who have been in exile over the years have returned, later in the years, have returned to Israel. In fact, I believe a lot of them are believed to have returned to the Galilee area during the time that the Maccabees had once again regained control over the political control over Jerusalem and over some of the surrounding area. But between Galilee, where we have Jewish people, and Jerusalem, where obviously there are Jewish people, is an area of Samaria. Now, back in history of Israel, there was one kingdom, and then at some point the kingdom split. And we had something like 9.5 tribes in the north form the kingdom of Samaria, and we had, it was 2.5 or something like that, it's a little confusing, tribes. Sorry? That's right, they called it the kingdom of Israel at the time. So they called the kingdom in the north the kingdom of Israel, and the kingdom in the south was the kingdom of Judah. And there was the tribe of Judah, but there was Benjamin, I believe, and part of one of the other tribes. So the southern kingdom was ruled by kings in Jerusalem, and they still had the temple, and they saw themselves as being the rightful worshippers of God. The northern kingdom was cut off from the temple, and a number of the kings there, especially the first couple of ones, but then it repeats itself, set up their own worship practices at first to try to worship the same God, but in their own territory. But God was not happy with the way they did that, and it's a more complicated story. But when the northern kingdom was conquered by outside forces, and it was conquered first before the southern kingdom, the Babylonians or the Persians, whoever it was that took over the area, Syrians, I can't remember, it was the Babylonians. Anyway, they came in, and the habit of many nations at the time when they would conquer a kingdom would be to take all of the powerful and educated people from that territory and ship them off back home. And what that does is you can use those people in your own political mechanisms and try to convert them over to your politics, and so they'll be loyal followers. But it also makes sure that there's nobody left behind to have revolts and things. And then what they would do is they'd put other people in their place. So they'd bring in other people to settle the land so that there was basically so they could convert the land over to their own culture and politics, and so that there would be no leftover resistance, or very less leftover resistance. The belief among the Jewish people at the time of Jesus is that the people who live in this area that now called Samaria are basically half-breeds at best, meaning that they are intermixed or interbred or interwed peoples of what was left of the people of Israel, the northern kingdoms or the northern tribes, and the people that were shipped in from other nations intermarried and became, well, unpure according to the Jewish people. Now, the people who lived in Samaria had a different idea. The people who lived in Samaria didn't so much think about the bloodlines as they thought about the fact that during the time of the Maccabees and other things that were going on in the southern kingdom, there was some corruption in the leadership of the priesthood. There was a question as to whether or not the priests or the priestly line that had been established before Jesus' time was actually the proper priestly line. And they believed that the temple had become corrupt and that true worship of God had to take place in some mountain in the northern kingdom. So when you read that story about the woman at the well, and Jesus is talking to the woman at the well in Samaria, and she talks about, well, you believe you worship in Jerusalem, and we believe we worship here, and Jesus just sort of sidesteps the whole question and says, there's coming a time where you'll worship God in spirit, not, we need temples and things. So that's to give you a little bit of background what's going on between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. They both believe that they're closer to God. They both believe that their religion is the purer one. But of course, our Bible's written by Jewish people, so we get more of their bent on it. And in fact, if you listen to Jesus, he says, no, the Jerusalem is where the temple is. That's where God started things, and they're following the rules better. But that's not the point. Anyway, So they go, what happens is, when pilgrims from the northern kingdom, from Galilee, want to go to Jerusalem for the festivals, they have two choices. They can travel through Samaria, or they can go around, right? And there is a road that goes around Samaria, but it adds a couple of days' journey, I guess, to the whole thing. And it appears that Jesus' intention is to travel through Samaria. And he sends some disciples ahead of himself to prepare the different towns along the way for the fact that he's coming through. I don't know whether, we don't have any history to tell us whether or not this is like, promoting a tour, like, we're coming to town, everybody be ready for it, or whether it was to find people that would help take care of the needs for foods and things, the place to buy food, or people that would share hospitality. Because in ancient times, especially in the Middle East, in that area, hospitality was a very important part of life, and it was a part of your culture. It didn't matter whether you liked people that came to town. You had to show some kind of token, at least hospitality, because when you had to travel, if something should happen, God forbid, you would be relying on the hospitality of strangers as well. And so it was a very important part of the culture of all people that lived in that part of the world at that time. So when it says that the people of the village did not welcome Jesus, that's important. That's a big deal. There was something going on here. This isn't necessarily normal everyday activities. Now, if we look at some historical accounts, there are times during the history, somewhere around the 1st century, that there was a fair amount of friction between the Samaritans and the Galilean Jews that were going to Jerusalem, because there are times when there have been some violence recorded in some historical accounts. But at this time, from the impression we get from the rest of Luke's gospel, this friction isn't necessarily there, and so this rejection by this village appears to be rather startling. And because of that, we look at the last half of the sentence and say, what's going on here? And it says, they did not welcome Jesus because he was on his way to Jerusalem. And that's why I sort of try to give you that background of that idea about worship, whether you worship in Jerusalem or whether you worship at this mountain. There's a big conflict in their religious stuff here. And it's kind of like, well, you've got a religious guy coming to town, but he's made it clear that he supports that other religion. And so, well, you can find another town to go through, I guess, is kind of the message. So when James and John saw this, they said to Jesus, so they've gone, either they've heard the message from other messengers, or they were the messengers that went to this particular village, and they go to Jesus and they say, Lord, should we call down fire from heaven to burn them up? That kind of, when we read this story, it sort of comes out of the blue, doesn't it? It's like, wow, that's weird. Like, we know these guys come up with some pretty strange ideas at times, right? And it would seem that they're coming up with an idea, somehow this idea of judgment, and there seems to be a sense of power, or that they should be able to, invoke God's power on behalf of Jesus. We see that going on, and we see that in these brothers, James and John. We see them asking Jesus, or their mother asking Jesus, to make them the right hand and left hand of Jesus in heaven or in the kingdom. So they seem to be looking for power in Jesus' kingdom. They're used as an example in more than one gospel of the disciples not getting that Jesus' kingdom isn't going to be about power. It isn't going to be about a violent reset of kingdom or of Israel.
But at the beginning of the chapter, it talks about how the disciples had been out healing people and, doing their own miracles.
Yep.
So now they've come back together. I think they still have a bit of that power there.
Quite possibly, yes.
Yes.
They're riding a high.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And that's a thing, right? That's what people do. But this idea of calling down fire doesn't come out of the blue. Our Old Testament reading was from Kings this morning. There's another one, and it was about Elijah and Elisha, and we'll touch on that as well. But another story about Elijah includes a passage where Elijah is ministering in the northern kingdom. And this is after the split. So the kingdom at this time would be the kingdom of Israel, but sometimes it's referred to already as the kingdom of Samaria, because the king of the northern kingdom rules from a town or city called Samaria. And that's where the names start to get interwoven. And so the king of the northern kingdom, of the northern tribes, is the king of Samaria, is often how he's referred to. Well, he's sick, and he sends some messengers to a prophet or a priest or something of another nation or another group of people who aren't Israelites, and to inquire of another god, Bezalel or something like that, about whether or not he's going to get better. And you read these kinds of stories, and it sort of has this idea that they're not just asking, am I going to get better? They're sort of entreating the deity to say you'll get better, so that you will, right? Well, on the way, the messengers run into Elijah, who happens to be a prophet of God of Israel, or the God of all of Israel. And God tells Elijah, well, I guess God tells Elijah to go meet them on the way. And he gives them this message to tell the king, is there no prophet in Israel that you should go and seek advice or an answer from some other god? Because of that, you're not going to get out of bed with your sickness. You're going to die from whatever it is you have. King's not happy. He sends some soldiers to go get Elijah and bring him back to the capital. Does anybody know what happens to those soldiers? 50 soldiers. Yes, Adam.
I love this story. They find Elijah and demand that he come with them, and Elijah says, they say, man of God, come with us. He says, if I'm a man of God, then may you and your soldiers be consumed by fire from heaven. And they are.
And then I don't know the size of the next group, but there's another group sent, and another 50.
Another 50 with the commander.
Go ahead, Adam, you tell.
You want me to finish it?
Go ahead.
Another group of 50 with a commander, and the exact same thing happens. A third group of 50 is then sent with their commander, except this time the commander begs Elijah to come, but being nice and humble, when Elijah agrees.
And then the story continues.
He goes to the king and says, yeah, you're not getting out of bed, and then the king does.
Not one of your happy stories, right? Okay, so this is a bizarre story in the Old Testament alone. You can know that John and James are familiar with this story because here they are in Samaria, the northern kingdom, and they encounter a village that doesn't want to welcome the prophet Jesus, and their go-to is, hey, we get to call down fire and wipe out that whole village. So that we believe that's where that comes from, right? We believe that's why they just didn't come up with let's bring fire from heaven, because nothing like that's been going on during Jesus' ministry. Jesus turns and rebukes them, and then they go to another village, because I guess there's more than one village you can go to on your way through Samaria. Rebuke, that word in Luke's gospel, it gets used most of the time, and it's a lot actually, for Jesus' response to demon possession. So when demons cry out, or when Jesus is casting out a demon, it says he rebukes them. And again, not too earlier in this story, there's the transfiguration. Boy, 1 week and I just lost my stride altogether. There's the transfiguration, and Jesus says that he has to die. And Peter says, that's not going to happen. We're not going to let that happen. And Jesus rebukes Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. So rebuke is a very strong word. The word that Luke uses here for this is a very powerful language. Jesus has not reacted well or kindly to the suggestion that they should burn the village down because of their rejection of Jesus. There's no sense in which Jesus wants to punish the people for rejecting him. It's just, let's just go to another village. That's their loss kind of attitude. So then we have the second half of our reading. And what we've got is we pick up with that journey thing, right? As they were walking along. And this is Luke's way of saying, they're traveling along. There's no particular agenda happening, and this is just to tell us this is more of that journey story. And we have three things here, three instances in which someone is either asking or being asked to follow Jesus. In the first one, someone comes up and asks. In the second one, it appears Jesus is asking someone to follow him. And then the third one, it just doesn't really say it. It just says the person first asks if they can go and say goodbye. So in the first one, they're just walking along, and someone says to Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go. Well, that's a nice proclamation. But Jesus replies by saying, the foxes have dens to live in, the birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to even lay his head. He's being a little parabolic or whatever. He's pointing out, using a sort of a saying kind of thing, that if you want to follow him, you have to give something up. Your sense of where you belong or where you come from, you're going to have to give up. Then Jesus says to another person, come and follow me. So now he's giving the invitation. And the man agrees, but he says, Lord, first let me return home and bury my father. To which Jesus responds, let the spiritually dead bury their own dead. Let the dead bury their own dead. Your duty is to go and preach about the kingdom of God. And so we see this kingdom of God coming back into the message. It'll be talked about a lot. That's what his ministry is about. But this is the second time that he's saying, you don't get to go back and do other things. If you're going to follow me, you have to leave behind your family and all of your family obligations. Burying your dead, or at least being there for the mourning period, is a very important part of their culture and a very important obligation. And we don't know. A lot of people come up with theories that the person was trying to put it off by a year or several years. They just wanted to go home and wait till his dad died before he would follow Jesus. And there is a sense in that culture, both Roman and Jewish, that you weren't, even adult male was not able to just leave his father until his father either gives him leave or passes away, because he's under his father's authority. But that's really not the point of the story. The point of the story is simply that there was an excuse, it was a good excuse, and Jesus just rejects it. And he doesn't just reject it, but he also says something that almost seems callous, right? Let the dead bury the dead. You get about the business you're supposed to do. Another said, yes, Lord, I will follow you, but first, they must have not been listening to the other two, right? But first let me say goodbye to my family. That doesn't seem like much, right? I just want to go home and say goodbye. But Jesus told him, anyone who puts a hand to the plow and then looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God. Now, here's another sort of echo of Old Testament, and we read it this morning. In our reading this morning, Elijah, the great prophet, who does call fire down from heaven in more than one instance, this Elijah is told by God to pass the mantle on, or to take a disciple, a follower, someone who will become his replacement, by going and finding this man named Elisha, who's going to be out in the field plowing, and put his robe over his shoulders. And this is a symbol of passing on the mantle. That's where we get that saying, pass on the mantle, of authority or of being a prophet or whatever. So he finds Elisha, he does this, and Elisha leaves his oxen. I never saw in this story before this morning that there were 12 pairs of oxen. So Elisha is part of some big community, either a big community plowing event, or his father is extremely rich, and they're out. They must be plowing a very huge field. And he leaves the oxen sitting there. So the other guys are going along, and Elisha is not doing his job. He runs after Elijah, who, of course, typical prophet fashion, walks up, throws his cloak over his shoulders, and then just walks away. He runs after him. He goes, I will follow you, but first let me go say goodbye. Kiss my father and mother goodbye. And Elijah lets him. And he doesn't just go kiss them goodbye. He goes back. He slaughters the 2 oxen that he's using to go through the field. He cuts up the plow and uses the wood to have a barbecue. And he cooks the oxen and has all the neighbors and everybody come in for a party, like a farewell party. It's like, hey, I've been chosen to be a prophet. Let's have a party, and then I'm leaving home. So in that story, God sees fit through Elijah to tell Elisha that it's okay to say goodbye. But in Jesus' story, and I got to think that Jesus is connecting the present lesson to this previous story, because he uses the analogy of plowing. You don't turn back from plowing. And anybody who plows, I've heard this from farmers, right? If you want nice straight rows, you can't be looking around the field at all, because then your plow goes, even if it's a tractor. With oxen, it's probably even worse. You've got to keep your eye on something in front of you to keep that row nice and even, right? So that's a good analogy, but at the end of the day, Jesus has left no wiggle room, right? When he calls people, or they volunteer, it's in these stories anyway, there's a fairly harsh black and white kind of feeling to the whole thing. It's like, no, drop everything, leave everything, and come follow me. And part of what's going on here that we need to realize is that always remember when we're reading in Luke that this is only half the story, right? Luke's gospel is the beginning of the story that Luke writes about Jesus' work on earth. The second half of the story is the book of Acts. We think of them oftentimes as two different stories, but it's one big story in two volumes, right? So we've got the Gospel of John, which is Jesus' work on earth while Jesus was on earth. Then we have the book of the Acts, which continues to be Jesus' work on earth through his church. And that's the way we should see those two books. And I've lost my train of thought when I was explaining that. So in this portion of Luke, Jesus is being very harsh about what people have to leave behind. And in other parts of Luke and other parts of all the gospel, Jesus teaches that we must pick up our own cross, that we must die to ourselves, that if we don't hate our mother and father in comparison to how we love Jesus, we don't love him enough. And this language is all rather odd to us and harsh, and it would be extremely harsh to his audience, more so than us even. But the context in which we need to see it is in the audience to which Luke is writing. Luke is writing to the early church, right? And the early church is this substitute family. And this is one of the most unique things about the early Christian church, is that they are bonding together and doing all of the things that they need to do for each other that a family does. And in a culture where family is so important, the idea of leaving home and following an itinerant preacher down the road, wherever it leads, is a huge thing. It's not like, we do it all the time, right? We leave home, go away to college, we leave college, go somewhere else to work. It's sad sometimes when we can't live in the same area as our families, but it's just a way of life. That is not the way of life for first century Middle Eastern people. The people that you grew up with are the people you rely on throughout your life. You have a network, a web of relationships that will take you from the cradle to the grave in this society. Moving around a lot is a bad thing. It's seen as unnatural, especially to the Jewish people. They're bound to their land, they're bound to their clan, they're very grounded and situated. And so this whole idea of not going back and finishing off your responsibilities to your family, of not saying goodbye, of leaving your home behind for good and not knowing where you will sleep tonight, this sounds like an awful lot to us. Just multiply that by 10 for them, right? But part of the reason Jesus is saying these things and setting people up in this way is because he's also telling them that you will regain 100-fold more than what you walk away from, because the kingdom that I want to bring on earth will look like family, except better. It will be healthy. It will take care of everyone, right? So where your family may neglect people who aren't close enough related to you, or that do something that shames you, or whatever things that they use excuses not to fulfill their responsibilities, in Jesus' family, in the one that he's building, we don't get excuses, right? In the kingdom that he's building, and you see it in Acts, we're called to be self-sacrificing to each other. And this whole, give it all up, isn't just to give it up to follow Jesus, it's to give it up to establish Jesus' kingdom. And it's a kingdom where we pull everyone in and we take care of each other. This new family is what Jesus wants to create, and the new family is centered on him. So there's this idea that he's emphasizing you have to choose between this new family, the kingdom, and the existing world that we know, right, that we're comfortable with. I may not like my family on earth, but they have an obligation to me. I have an obligation to them. I know the rules. I know how it works. It's comfortable. But Jesus calls people to give all of that up, to turn their backs on everything that they know and how it's supposed to work in their culture, and instead to prefer this new kingdom. And again, for the people he's talking to, they don't see this kingdom yet, right? It doesn't exist for them yet. It's just beginning to form. In the book of Acts, it's still just beginning to form. But we see some pretty amazing things happening in the book of Acts when that family starts to take shape in the way that Jesus intends it to. So, I see a big contrast between the two halves of our story this morning. In the beginning, we have Jesus beginning this journey on the road, and we have a group of people, a village, that says, nope, you're not welcome here. And we have the followers of Jesus who want to react harshly. They want to judge the people for not seeing who Jesus is. But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't take the time even to judge them or to mete out any kind of vengeance or judgment, or he's not harsh towards those people at all. We'll just find another village, is kind of the attitude. But where he is harsh in this whole story this morning is towards people who want to follow him. First, towards his disciples, his good friends. John and James are like practically his best friends. These two guys and Peter, they got to go up on the mountain. And so he's harsh with them. It's like, you're not going to do that. We're not going to pull fire down on anybody. That's not what I'm here to do. And then he's fairly harsh, or difficult anyway, with people who want to follow him or whom he wants to follow him. And he wants to make sure that they understand that his standards are very high for people who want to be part of the kingdom. We must count the cost, is what Jesus is sort of reminding his audience of. That being a part of his kingdom will come at a cost. And the cost he's talking about isn't outside persecution. It's about what we have to leave behind. It's about a denial of ourselves. And that's not to say that there isn't persecution. That's talked about in other places in the New Testament. But in our story today, we're centered in this idea that the calling to be part of the kingdom isn't about how we're going to set everybody else straight. It's about our level of commitment to that kingdom and to Jesus, the leader of the kingdom, the person who is bringing about this new reality of being able to be a family with everybody and anybody. So this morning, I guess I want to leave you with is, as the church, we are supposed to be the kingdom. And if we looked at only the passages that we read this morning, what does that tell us as a church, as part of Jesus' kingdom? Should we be concerned with what's going on in the lives of people who don't acknowledge Jesus? Or should we be concerned with leaving behind a culture that wants us to divide our loyalty between Jesus and ourselves in order to build a kingdom where those people who don't know about Jesus, don't care about Jesus, will see something and want to be a part of it? I believe Jesus wants us to be about building a kingdom that will attract everyone and that will reach out to the people who need it the most. Let's pray.